Now we are.
There we go. Good morning, everybody. I'm Katy Ruckle. I'm the state's Chief Privacy Officer. If you don't know me, I have worked for the state for 16 years, and I have been in the role of State Chief Privacy Officer since January 1st, 2020. And today I have John Pincus here. He was a fellow automated decision making system work group member, and I am really honored to have him here. And John, it would be great if you wanted to introduce yourself to everybody at today's webinar.
Sure, and thanks very much for having me here. I'm very excited to be here. I'm John Pincus. I'm a researcher, software engineer, and strategist. My background includes time at Microsoft Research, where I was a senior researcher focusing on software engineering and security. I was general manager of strategy development there. Before that, and since then, I've founded startups. My claim to fame is in the 90s doing a software engineering startup where we analyzed source code automatically and found defects. And then that's how Microsoft wound up acquiring me. Not that Microsoft has ever had any bugs in their code, but just on the off chance they might in the future. And as Katy says, I was a member of the ADS work group. I'm also working on a privacy newsletter, The Nexus of Privacy, where I talk about ADS as well as privacy issues.
Thanks, John. So quickly, I'm just going to go over what we're planning to cover today. We're going to talk about what is an automated decision-making system, what are the concerns about the use of these systems, what are the regulation approaches across Washington and the federal government, and other external recommendations. Then we have some additional resource for you, and I'll wrap it up with a connection to privacy. So we'll go ahead and jump right into the substantive material, which is what is an automated decision-making system. So John, do you want to talk about the definition and how we think about this?
Sure. I mean, there's a lot of different definitions, and it turns out, as we'll discuss later, it's a surprisingly hard problem to come up with a definition everybody agrees on. But at a very high level, automated decision-making is, well, it's making a decision by automated means. So any computer-assisted decision, it can be based on data, it can be based on digital profiles, which is created over time. It can be based on inferences, lots of different examples. Whether or not we decide, whether or not we give somebody a loan, a test that we're using for recruiting or evaluating job candidates, and it's got algorithms based on what you fill out on any kind of test. And we use this term both for decision systems that are fully automated, where the computer completely makes the decision, or when the ADS system is used to help people make decisions. Usually there's some kind of human interaction in there as well, but when people are relying or even taking the automated decisions into account, we count that as an automated decision-making system.
Right, and so we talked about this definition in the work group, in the automated decision-making system, and our work group never came up with a consensus on what the actual definition should be, or how to interpret the definition that was provided. And so it helps to sort of think about ADS on a spectrum, all the way from any algorithm or formula from in an Excel-based worksheet, all the way up to more complex artificial intelligence, where machine learning is occurring based on the data fed into the program. And I'd like to think about some of the examples of AI in use right now are a lot of the apps that interpret what images are. So there are apps that help people that may be visually impaired, and there's millions of images of dogs and cats and different things that you see that are scanned into these machines, and then the machine will identify those based on how it's interpreting those, reading those images. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, at the other spectrum, is a spreadsheet an automated decision system? Well, It can be. Suppose there's an example where hospitals use spreadsheets to allocate who gets vaccines. That's certainly making a decision. So in many definitions, including the ones I tend to use, I'd count that as an automated decision system. Still, it's very different in nature than these kinds of AI or machine learning systems that Katy's talking about. The risks and complications are very different. And I think that all feeds into why it's so challenging to come up with a good definition. We're not the only work group that hasn't been able to come to consensus on this. There's the New York City work group, automated decision systems work group a few years ago. They basically degenerated into a huge fight, starting with the definition of a system.
Right, and so these are some headlines that I pulled in terms of why there's concern and where you hear about some of the risk when it comes to relying on the decisions that these systems are making. So you can see that there's been lawsuits. Meta, which is Facebook, essentially has been sued based on its algorithms that have been alleged to harm.
Did we just lose Katy?
And their algorithm with the information they had, in which skewed heavily male in terms of the people that they already had working at Amazon. And so the recruiting engine was filtering out women. There has also been different problems with Google's algorithm, with people of color, Spotify, in terms of what music is getting recommended, and even having impacts on financial security and prospects. So these are all what we think of the big tech, Facebook, Meta, Amazon, Google. But I would like to share too that there are public sector impacts, and that's where our state has really been interested in this area. And so these are some headlines based on some risk and negative impacts on reliance of algorithms to make decisions for providing care or benefits to people, and even arresting people based on bad facial recognition systems. So particularly some of the, one of the most probably egregious use cases was there was a system that was deciding benefits for people with some disabilities in terms of they had diabetes, and sometimes people with diabetes have to have their feet amputated or a foot amputated, and the algorithm was reading it as long as the person didn't have a foot, then that means they didn't have foot problems. And so their services were reduced based on that. And so that's part of the risk that we're trying to identify and alleviate, so that there's not these sort of what would be very obvious to a human, that having a foot amputated would mean that you're still going to need services, is not as obvious to a computer making these decisions. Do you have anything to add about some of these headlines, John?
No, just that if you look at these, well, who's the burden of these algorithmic problems typically fall on? Well, it can happen to anybody, but it's people with disabilities. Not so coincidentally, all of the reported cases of people who have been arrested on bad facial recognition matches, they're all Black men, because, well, facial recognition doesn't work as well on Black people. So we have to take into account how these kinds of algorithmic problems can reflect the kinds of biases and discrimination we have in society more broadly.
So what are some approaches that you're seeing?
So these are taken from the Ada Lovelace Group's report last summer, where they classified several different approaches to ADS regulation. One is just coming up with overall principles and guidelines, because, and I think this works well in a government context where people want to do the right thing, maybe doesn't work as well in a private context where some companies are more concerned about making money than doing the right thing. The other extreme is completely prohibiting some kinds of technology. So several places have prohibited facial recognition technology, for example. There's transparency requirements, or there's requirements for, well, we want to use these tools, but we need to know more. Algorithmic impact assessments are a technique to evaluate your algorithms and how they can affect people. Audits or formal regulatory inspections are the next level up. More formal processes to examine these, putting in oversight bodies. Very important is to give people rights to know. Well, transparency is an example, to know when an algorithmic system is being used to make a decision, to understand why it's making this. If you've got a person making the decision, well, you can at least ask them. When it's an algorithm, sometimes you can't even understand why they're making the decision. And then some process issues, hearings and appeals when there's going wrong. And then specific to government entities, they can also put in procurement conditions that, for example, it needs to have had an algorithmic impact assessment in order to purchase it. And this is all very nascent. At the end, we'll talk about some of the different approaches that are happening around the world, but until a few years ago, none of these things had really been tried out. This is a very fast-moving field.
Right, and so that leads us into what Washington's approach was in terms of noticing these issues and complications and impacts to disparate communities, disparate impacts to certain communities. And so Senator Hasegawa has introduced a legislation a couple times, going back even to 2019, in terms of procurement and use of ADS in Washington. It was one of the first of the country at the time. And then he introduced another bill, Substitute Senate Bill 5116 in 2021 to establish guidelines for procurement and use again, and encouraging more transparency in government. So this is a headline in the article from GovTech talking about that move in Washington. And so in 2021, when Senator Hasegawa introduced 5116, it didn't pass, but it did result in the proviso, which it created the automated decision-making system work group that John and I were both members of. And so it provided $12,000 for the group to come together. And the purpose of the group was to develop recommendations for policy and changes in the state of Washington regarding the procurement and the use of ADS by our public agencies. John, did you want to talk any more about the ADS work group, or?
Well, first of all, about the process that led to creating it, I think our legislators in both parties understood that this is a problem, but there was a general feeling that, well, we don't know enough about it, and so that was the purpose that created what led to creating the work group, which I thought was a very good incremental step. Yeah, I think you've got a slide talking about the participants in the work group. I was there from the perspective of a researcher, and I think they did a very good job in constructing who is going to be on the work group, including research institutions such as me and Maria Angel from University of Washington, and then also very important representatives from the organizations that are representing the communities that are the most vulnerable to being harmed by these biases, because those are voices that are incredibly important to get in there. I have to admit, I was eager to participate, but also very nervous. As I mentioned, that New York State ADS work group had not gone particularly well, but there was a huge difference here. I think in New York, the government really didn't want to do this. They got forced into this. What we saw with this work group is, no, all the participants from state agencies were very interested in understanding the problem. We're very open about sharing the real world constraints that you're all working under. And I think everybody worked towards something achievable. Katy's excellent facilitation skills probably had something to do with that as well.
Well, thanks, John. I appreciate that. Yeah, and I wanted to highlight that the advocacy community members included groups like the ACLU, the Commission on Hispanic Affairs, the Council on American Islamic Relations of Washington, the Governor's Committee for Disability Issues and Employment and La Residencia and Mijenta was the last group. And so we were recommended in the proviso to have at least 5, and we had 7. And so as you can see, we had 28 members in total on this work group that came together to write this report and have some really in-depth discussions about what sort of recommendations we should make for our policymakers in Washington. And so, John, do you want to talk about some of the key research findings from our work group?
Yeah, I should also point out that we brought in several outside experts, and all of the information is up on the OPDP website. It was an extremely transparent process. You know, our key findings, well, it starts with the fact that ADS, they have a lot of values as ways to reduce costs, improve deliveries of services, make decisions more efficient, reliably, and accurate. I mean, it's impossible to imagine how we'd govern and provide these state benefits today without ADS. That said, ADS can be discriminatory, inaccurate. They can lack transparency and accountability, all the headlines that Katy was showing earlier. And really, there's just been a rapid understanding of how these systems operate and the risks. The whole field of computer science, nobody was really talking, well, that's not fair. A few very foresighted people have been talking about this since the 90s, but the field as a whole largely didn't pay a lot of attention to this to the past 5 to 10 years. And so most of our systems, the systems that we use in industry and government, were built before we had this real understanding. So there's this, what we call technical debt. The systems have been built without fully understanding this. When I was at Microsoft, we went through in around 2000, 2001, we went through a similar shift where, gosh, a lot of the software had been built without taking into security really into account, and had to make a lot of changes to adjust to that. That's where we are in general with ADS systems today. So this presents a real opportunity. Washington can be a leader in ensuring that government use of ADS doesn't cause discrimination and other kinds of harm. We've got great universities here. We've got world-class tech companies. We've got a very tech-savvy government workforce as compared to many other states. The report goes into details on all of these.
Yes, and as we mentioned, the slide deck will be distributed, and there's a link to the report in the work group. If you have an interest in watching the work group meetings, they were all recorded and posted, and the public was actually invited to attend as well. So we did make it a very transparent process in terms of our meetings, our agendas, and what we discussed. And so as a result, we did of many robust discussions and serious drafting sessions. We met and we came up with 7 recommendations. And so the first recommendation that we came up with was the prioritization of resources. So there was a recognition when we were talking about the spectrum of what is an automated decision-making system, that if we have 6,000 applications in the state, we're not going to be able to assess 6,000 systems. And so we, at least not initially. And so there was a recommendation to develop a framework to decide which systems should be evaluated. And so we could use our resources appropriately to prioritize the systems that have the most impact on individuals. And then the second assessment was about procurement. In terms of part of the procurement process, we should be assessing the potential impacts on the risks to rights and freedoms of people, and what existence of risk or bias or inaccuracy are potential results of the system, and how transparent the systems are in terms of their working for the public. And I should note that these are not the full text of the recommendations. The full text of the recommendations are in the report. So we're just going over the highlights. So John, do you want to talk about recommendations 3 and 4 of the work group?
Sure. I mean, these all tie in that. And if you think about it from a software engineering perspective, it makes a lot of sense that you got to prioritize. The first two Katy talked about, you prioritize, you stop, you look at the new things you're building with a strong eye, and then you evaluate your existing systems to see where they are. The ADS currently in use by the state that produce legal effects on people, we should be assessing them. Yeah, which ones should we be assessing? Well, if they're processing data on a large scale, or if they have a lot of effects on the rights and freedom of people. Also requiring transparency of use, procurement, development of any of these systems. And specifically that includes monitoring and testing for accuracy and bias. This is something that hasn't consistently happened with Washington state systems or any other state. And again, particularly the systems that are producing these legal effects on people.
Yeah, and a couple of things to note in terms of evaluation of existing systems. We were instructed as a work group to pick some existing systems and see how we could evaluate them. And the work group chose to evaluate Department of Corrections system that makes decisions in terms of the types of risk of individuals being released into the community, and what sort of restrictions should be on them in terms of their risk level. And there's a lot of subjective criteria that goes into those evaluations. And so that's an example of a system that has a large effect on somebody's rights and freedoms in terms of what they're allowed to do if they're released into the community. And so that's an example of a system that has higher risk than, say, an algorithm that decides what font you should be using in terms of when you DocuSign. That was an example that I heard from Adobe developers one time. So if you're thinking about what are the potential impacts that this system is making, somebody's rights and freedoms are going to be a higher risk system than the type of font they're using to sign their documents with, if that helps to kind of translate there.
And that system's also a great example of how what I said about how the whole field of computer science really hasn't paid attention to accuracy and bias of these, or to the bias of these systems until recently. It's based on peer-reviewed research published in a top-tier journal. And when I went back and I read the research paper from 2014 or 2016, there's no mention at all of the possibilities of bias of the algorithm. It just shows that we weren't paying attention to it back then.
Right. And so the next two recommendations were interesting discussion for the work group, because we were tasked by the legislature to determine if there was any circumstances in which we would just recommend a straight prohibition in the use of the type of AI-enabled profiling. And the work group did not actually identify a type of technology that they would say should be prohibited. Examples of some of the higher risk technologies that have been prohibited, or there's moratoriums on their use, include some of the facial recognition systems. The work group essentially decided that they weren't sure what may be coming down the pike, and they didn't want to necessarily foreclose the use by an outright prohibition. But we did recommend having a framework to evaluate whether or not there are some use cases that are so high risk and impactful to people's rights and freedoms that they should actually be prohibited by use in the state. And then in terms of the ongoing monitoring and auditing recommendation, this goes to show to make sure that it's not a one and done exercise in terms of your evaluation of the algorithms, because they change and get tweaked and software is updated over time, or there may be new impacts that weren't recognized initially in the use of the system, but are more apparent later on. And so it's not, it's meant to be an ongoing monitoring and auditing of the algorithms in terms of what types of impacts they're having on populations within the state, and especially ensuring that there's not discrimination against particular individuals, or other individuals are treated less favorably than others, than groups in Washington state. So do you have anything to add about these two recommendations, John?
Just stressing that all of these recommendations, we really reached consensus on these recommendations, which was extremely, which was challenging, and really kudos to everybody on the work group for talking about these difficult issues. Question in the chat from Jeremy: define in use case studies of what AI enabling profiling should be prohibited. I'll get to an example of that later on when we talk about European approaches to regulation.
Yes, thanks for the question. So the last recommendation was essentially training the state workforce in terms of the risk of automation bias and the fact that this can occur in terms of the use and development and procurement of these systems. Sometimes there's too much reliance on what the system is recommending. And so there is just a need to make sure there's an awareness of this risk in the workforce. So the next slide shows a sample prioritization matrix. And this really goes to the first recommendation that had to do with trying to decide which systems are the highest risk and should be assessed first. And so this just sort of sets out a simple method in determining which systems may have the highest impact on the largest amount of people or significant impacts to their legal rights and freedoms. And so those types of systems are going to be a high impact and maybe even a complex system that would be more high likelihood of risk of bias or discriminatory impact. And so we want to make sure those are prioritized in terms of evaluation, down to the ones that are sort of the lower impact, lower risk, a smaller group of people. So John, do you have anything else you want to talk about in terms of how we were trying to help agencies possibly evaluate what systems should be assessed?
First of all, just to say, wow, this is a really challenging problem, and it's a tough engineering problem with finite resources. I mean, in a perfect world, we just stop doing everything for however long it takes and get to the bottom of all of this. But meanwhile, back on planet Earth, we've got to decide where to put the finite resources. And I think looking at the combination of impact and risk is a very good way to do it. And to be clear, this is a sample prioritization matrix. I think there needs to be more work to be done to do anything that's globally available in the short term. I think it's really up to agency leads who have the best understanding of their own software and their own circumstances to use this kind of basic thinking to come up with what the right prioritization is.
Yeah, so where are we now? There was an actual, the 5116 that created the proviso that led to the work group was reintroduced in the last legislative session. It was passed through the state government committee, and it went to the Ways and Means Committee in the Senate and was actually placed for executive session. There was a hearing. I will say, I think, John, you testified in favor of the bill. I testified against
Indeed.
the bill.
Awkward.
So this goes to show we were on opposite sides in terms of what should happen with the bill, but we're still friendly and working together, and important that we address this problem in Washington. And I will say that I did support the premise of the bill, that we of course do not want discriminatory impacts in our systems, but the concerns were that it was a little bit too much too fast for agencies, and it did result in potential for prohibiting the use of systems that I was concerned the impact of the not using the systems would have more harm than good, than help the vulnerable populations that that rely on the benefits that they get from some of these systems.
Right. I mean, the worst case is that well-intentioned legislation shuts down the system, unintentionally shuts down all these systems that the state government depends on. And so people were coming at it from different perspectives.
Right. So there was, the bill didn't pass, but there was proviso language again. The proviso was actually vetoed by the governor, and it would have required an inventory and also guidance on a kind of a tight timeline. And so the governor, while he vetoed the proviso, he did still direct WATEC to develop guidance for agencies' procurement and use of automated decision-making systems, and then also conduct a preliminary inventory of what systems are currently in use. And I have linked the governor's veto message in the slide deck, and the timeline that he put us on for these two deliverables is November 30th, 2023. So right now we are in the midst of conducting the inventory. And so some of you may or may not be involved in the annual certification process that occurs, but all of the state agencies, especially those in the executive branch, are required to do an annual certification. And there is a new question on the annual certification this year to talk about what should be included in the inventory. And John and I talked about this definition, and it is narrower than the one that was in the proviso and a little bit narrower than the one that we talked about in initially. But this is, so I think the way you phrased it, John, is that it's not that some of these may not be ADSs, it's just that for purposes of the inventory, this is what's going to be included.
Yeah, I'd say the definition includes both what is an ADS and some prioritization. And it's very sensible to say that, well, if it's got the specific criteria that are set by law, then that's not the place to focus on first.
Right. And so this definition that we're using to help agencies determine what is the ADS inventory is thinking about systems that affect individuals, and there is some interpretation of criteria that's being set by the agency. So examples include the system that I was talking about in terms of who is likely to recidivate based on subjective risk criteria, which households may receive are at risk of becoming homeless, or different assessment of penalties or loss of benefits that are not based on rules defined in law. And so so what is not an inventory are really those, or what are not ADS that should be included in the inventory are those systems that are just strictly applying the criteria that is set in the law, and there's no judgment or interpretation or subjective criteria that the agency is applying or interpreting the law. It's just a straight, this is what it is, and the system is just applying that rule. And so that includes, like, you know, when your driver's license is renewed, that's a straight like date, right? Based on when the last time you were renewed, or other applications to your license. So those types of systems are not to be included in the inventory we're conducting right now. And to help with that workflow, we put together some questions to help sort of how you think about it. Does the system actually process personally identifiable information? Is it impacting individuals? Does it make decisions based on criteria specifically defined in law? And if it doesn't, then is it impacting individuals processing personal information? And then also based on subjective criteria, then you're going to be clicking the yes box on that. And there's some definitions in the sidebar. And just for agencies' information, this workflow and the definitions are available on the website, and I have a link for that later. So for the definitional struggles, we've talked a little bit. Oh, sorry, John, did you want to say?
Actually, there was a question in chat about when would be a good time for agencies to start working on the inventory.
So the inventory is already, work is already occurring. So your agency's attestations are due actually tomorrow. So that's been going on for a couple of months. So if you're not aware of that activity within your agency, my guess is I would recommend contacting the Chief Information Officer of your agency, because they're the ones that are aware of that activity within your agency and who's working on that. So somebody already is working on that in your agency. However, I'm going to get to the questions where the inventory where it says yes, no, and unsure. And if you're clicking the unsure button, then we'll our office, the Office of Privacy and Data Protection, will be following up with you. So I included the definitional struggles that John alluded to earlier, that I guess came to blows or something in New York, or at least verbal blows, maybe I should say. But this was the definition provided in the proviso. And what I wanted to highlight here in the terms of this being broader is it's talking about any system that makes or supports government decisions. So that would include more human intervention in terms of the system. So if the system is helping a human make the decision, then that's also part of what the support language is meant to capture. Did you have more about the proviso language definition?
This is closer to the standard definition that's used in research communities and by the White House Office of Science and Technology. This very broad definition. So on the previous flow chart, I would have just labeled the boxes at the end differently. All these systems are, based on this language, all these systems would be considered ADS, but they don't need to be included in the inventory. So it's just two different ways of looking at it.
Right. And the exercise right now for the inventory is really trying to help the state get our arms around what's in scope. And so I put in terms of future conversations about what we should be doing in the state. So there is on the ocio.wa.gov communications website, and this link is live as well, there are the definition we're using for the inventory and the guidance documents that are a part of this annual certification that's occurring. So the next slide shows what I was talking about in terms of the application inventory. This is where the question is whether or not the system or application that's in your inventory should be in your application inventory should be designated as an ADS system in the ADS inventory. And so the drop down is yes, no, or unsure. And if the unsure is checked and that's okay, then we'll just be following up with you to help kind of work through what the system is doing and whether it should be in the inventory or not. So another piece of the annual certification that I want to include as a reminder for agencies is that Washington does have a facial recognition law, and there is a question on the inventory, and this is the question that's part of the attestation process, which essentially says that if you're planning to use facial recognition services at your agency, then making sure that you're following the requirements of the law. And there needs to be a notice of intent filed with the Technology Services Board for the agency, unless you're exempt, and there's a couple of exemptions listed in the law. And so, John, did you want to talk a little bit more about that law and then some others that you're seeing regarding facial recognition?
Yeah, this facial recognition law passed in 2020. It was a fairly contentious debate. There was a proposal for a moratorium on government use of facial recognition. There was initially a fairly weak regulatory proposal, and they came up with what eventually passed was a compromise, which has a lot of the aspects of this general ADS recognition that I talked about. In general, there's been more attention paid to facial recognition than other kinds of ADS because to some extent because the harms when they happen are just so obvious of people being falsely identified. So the law requires accountability reports, which are kind of like the algorithmic impact assessments. There's testing and training requirements for people using these systems. There's some restrictions on using these systems for surveillance. A big concern about facial recognition is what happened, say, in Baltimore when there were a lot of protests after Freddie Gray. The police used facial recognition to scan all the protesters and see who had outstanding warrants. Gosh, that seems very close to general surveillance, and so there's a lot of resistance to that. The facial recognition law had some limits on this broad, unconstrained use of facial recognitions. This is one of the first statewide laws on facial recognition, and industry wound up supporting it. That was initially very, very contentious, but industry wound up supporting it, not least because they preferred this to a moratorium on facial recognition. But I think there's general sentiment that, yeah, we need some guardrails, and particularly relatively responsible companies like Microsoft understand the risks when completely irresponsible companies, who I won't name, use facial recognition. And so they were big proponents of this. There's also been some other regulation in Washington state, mostly on facial recognition. King County passed an ordinance last year. Bellingham had a referendum that prohibited government use both of facial recognition and predictive policing technologies. This is another kind of automated decision system where the decision is, where do we pre-allocate officers, and so can also have these kinds of racial biases. Seattle surveillance ordinance, the original version was passed in 2010 or so, and it was updated in 2018. This also requires surveillance impact reports on surveillance-related technologies, which can include automated decision systems. Just earlier this week, it was announced that the upcoming Seattle budget has a $1 million allocation for ShotSpotter, which is an automated gunshot detection technology, which is in fact an automated decision system. And so, according to the Seattle surveillance ordinance, there needs to be an impact report and an analysis of the impact before that gets improved. Again, Washington State has really been on the cutting edge of a lot of these issues. I think Seattle surveillance ordinance was the first one that had passed. King County was the first county to regulate facial recognition. Bellingham was the first place to pass something by referendum. So we really are on the cutting edge here.
And what about in other states?
What about in other states? I'm glad you asked. Well, you know, the New York City, although their task force was less than completely successful, it did result in a law governing the use of AI systems in hiring, an AI employment law where people have to do impact assessments and analyses. That's about to go into effect early next year. Right now, it's a little confusing because the agencies that's supposed to issue the detailed regulations hasn't yet, so nobody's sure what to do, and the clock is ticking. And that really highlights some of the challenges of doing these legislations. It's all new. We're all trying to figure this out. And so it'll be interesting to see how that works out. There's a lot of other state and local prohibitions on government use of facial recognition, about 20 cities around the country. Portland, Oregon also prohibits some private use of facial recognition in places of public accommodation in broad public sectors. Some of the privacy laws also have ADS-related regulations. For example, California's and Colorado's privacy laws both give people the right to opt out of AI-related profiling. What does that exactly mean? Well, that's still to be determined. We're waiting for the detailed regulations to be limited. Does that mean that people can opt out of having automated loan decisions made? It's not clear. California's got it's often described as their kids' privacy law. It goes beyond privacy, but it's basically to protect children, and it prohibits profiling of minors. It also has some algorithmic transparency requirements. And then they've got a bill in California similar to our SB 5116 regulating the government use and procurement of these systems.
Are the feds talking about this?
Indeed, they are. In fact, just this morning, I sent Katy a hurried a note saying, "Oh, they must have known about our presentation today." Just this morning, Representatives Ted Lieu and Yvette Clark. Representative Clark has been one of the leaders on this. They introduced a facial recognition act that would have some limits on law enforcement's use of facial recognition. There's also a proposed moratorium. Again, the focus starts with facial recognition. Beyond that, there's been broader focus on the commercial use of ADS system. Representative Clark's Algorithmic Accountability Act of 2022. There's some algorithmic impact assessment requirements in the privacy bill that's currently pending. The FTC is doing a potential rulemaking, and they're putting, again, commercial use of these systems within their scope. Last October, while we were in our work group, there was a big announcement from the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. They came up with an AI Bill of Rights, and they've announced their intent to do some federal regulation that might include procurement. So far, there haven't been any updates since then, so not completely clear what's happening now on that front.
And beyond the state and federal, what is happening in the international community?
Yeah, and internationally, people are largely ahead of several countries are largely ahead of the US. Canada's had a directive in 2019 focusing on government use that required these algorithmic impact assessments before deploying these ADS. And the most complete regulations is the European Union's Draft AI Act, which applies both to commercial use and government use of system. That's a big difference in philosophy between European legislation and the US. We tend to have separate laws applying to commercial and government use. They put them all together in a single law. And they take this tiered approach. There's some systems that they completely ban, they completely prohibited, and that includes social scoring. This is Jeremy's question earlier about what AI profiling should be prohibited. China, for example, uses, they call it a social credit system, where they watch everything you do, including your social media activities, including everything, and use that to do scores that govern what rights you have. I think in Europe and the US as well, there's a lot of concern that, no, we don't want to be like that. And so this is the top AI-enabled profiling use case that tends to get banned. They also prohibit manipulative systems, and so they're very focused on emotional manipulation. On the other hand, they don't prohibit emotional recognition systems, which could be used in an AI-enabled profiling system. There's some question as to whether or not they should, but that would be an example of an AI-enabled profiling use case that's not prohibited even by the EU. And they similarly limit some public uses of facial recognition. They've got the previous draft prohibited biometric uses, but there's now some pushback on that, and that's getting negotiated. Their next classification is high-risk systems, and those are the one. It's very similar to the idea of significant impact on people. They tick off a few categories: employment, law enforcement, services, migration, critical infrastructure related systems, and those have some pretty significant responsibilities and requirements in the bill, including audits, transparency requirements, et cetera. Then there's a lot of systems which are just minimal risk, the ones where people aren't directly affected or the effects aren't significant, and they wave their hands and they encourage voluntary codes of conduct, but there's no active regulation. And they're still negotiating the final version of that. So many large American companies are multinational that this will certainly have a big effect on US-based companies, to be determined how much effect it has on US legislation. We often look at European legislation, but rarely use it as a direct model.
Thanks, John. And I was going to note, we're getting short on time, but I did want to raise, if there was a prohibition of use in Washington, I do have a lot of concerns about those technologies that are claiming to be able to read emotions of people based on their facial expressions. So
yeah, they're horribly biased. There was a great example of NBA players where, gosh, if you look at the black players in the NBA, they were just completely misdiagnosed as they look angry, they look angry, they look angry. What societal stereotypes have we embedded in our software here? Something I briefly wanted to mention, and this ties back to the fast-moving field. When we did our work group, one of the things we talked about is there weren't any really industry best practices for if you want to go above and beyond what's regulated and do best in class work, what should you do? We don't really know. Since then, the Algorithmic Justice League has published this really outstanding work on looking at industry best practices for what should be done. They're applying it both commercially and government. And I think this is certainly something to look at in terms of, I don't know how much regulation is going to follow this in the short term. In the longer term, it's probably a regulatory direction, but from an engineering perspective, as you're thinking about designing and building the next versions of your processes or the underlying systems, these are all things to be paying attention to. And if you look at what our work group did, I'm really proud of, we did several of these things quite well, including directly involving the stakeholders most likely to be harmed by the AI systems in our process.
So as John mentioned, this is not new and it's been talked about for quite some time or many years. And so the federal government has put out several resources. So I have put those here as links, and we looked at those as part of our work group. So many of you will recognize, the Government Accountability Office and NIST, which is something we rely on with a lot of our cybersecurity framework and even some of the privacy framework we're doing. And then, of course, the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, is also putting out information about the use of AI and concerns about impacts. And so, we've talked a lot about the risk, but I did want to mention that we're not saying the use of AI or ADS is inherently bad. And John did talk about, a lot of benefits in their use in terms of efficiency and be able to provide more services. But it's just making sure that there is recognition that the use of these and the scale of these we shouldn't be ignorant to the impacts. And so that's where it's like, where security may not have been considered initially in some of the software built years ago, we wouldn't dream about releasing things without security protections now, especially those processing personally identifiable information. And so there's been lots of examples where there is the use of ADS and AI, and we're talking about the risk is for those systems that are impacting individuals. There's a lot of areas where it's used, for example, in cybersecurity, where you're doing large-scale analysis and scanning of networks and determining whether or not certain behavior or use or extracting data is, sets off alarms and those types of things. And so that's the type of use that we want to make sure that we're not saying that there shouldn't be use of ADS and AI. We're just trying to help raise awareness of some of the less desirable effects of the use of these systems. Do you have anything to add about that, John?
No, totally agree. It's these are valuable technologies and they're powerful technologies. And just like any other powerful technology, you want to use them taking into account both the benefits and the risks.
Right. And I think this just came out last week that, in Miami-Dade, they're making an AI center to boost the workforce. And that's based on the US Bureau of Labor Statistics projecting that by 2029, we're going to have more than 500,000 new jobs in artificial intelligence. And so I think that just demonstrates the fact that these types of skills and use of these systems is going to continue. And so I think some of the steps we're taking in Washington to be aware of their use and not limit innovation, but make sure we're addressing the risk continues. And so This is where I wanted to briefly connect to, privacy and how the use of these systems really do tie a lot to the privacy principles we have in the state of Washington, which includes, the lawful, fair, responsible use of data. That means, collection and use is appropriate, and you're not going beyond the reason that you have collected the data and are using the data. That's our purpose limitation principle. And then also data minimization is a principle that can be used here in terms of, the type of data that we're collecting and using and processing in these systems, and making sure we're only collecting and using to what we need to accomplish. So there really is a tie to our principles. This also highlights the transparency and accountability, which were both key pieces of the recommendations from the work group, and having some due diligence as well in terms of reasonable care with the third parties that are processing this information, and when possible, allowing individuals to consent or have more information about the use of the data. And so this is just a quick plug for the fact that we do have a training online. There's a training that's in the Learning Center, but we've also made it available on the public internet, so you can't take it where you're actually getting credit in LMS or doing the knowledge checks. It tells you what the answers are. But if you're interested in getting a high level review of privacy and privacy in the state of Washington and the privacy principles and some best practices, I recommend watching that video on our website. It's about 33 minutes, so it's not too intensive. So I think that's everything for our presentation today, and I want to thank everybody for joining us. Are there any outstanding questions in our last few minutes?
From the chat, if employees have concerns about the use or planned use of ADS at their agencies, is there a reporting route they can use to ensure the situation gets an impartial review?
So right now, that's not a formal process, but if there are concerns that you have or want to raise questions about the use of systems in the agencies, I would encourage you to reach out to our office and we can help facilitate those conversations. Okay, well, I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.